Howdy, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, debt slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, mate sacks, cousins. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about country music as U.S. propaganda. And this is a fairly recent development and a rather peculiar one that I became interested in years ago, 2003, when there was this whole fracas revolving around Dixie Chicks. And they were at the top of the country music empire at the time, and then in 2003 one of them made a remark about being embarrassed that they were from the same state that George Bush was born in, and their career quickly fell, and the entire conservative country base turned their back on the Dixie Chicks. So it's just another interesting development, and of course all the more interesting because if the Dixie Chicks had come out and said that they were embarrassed that they were from the same state as Barack Obama, of course their sales would have doubled. So this says that this political ideology that has become associated with country music is a formidable force and something to consider. And it's not like music in general hasn't always been political. We can go all the way back to when music first became secular, or even the idea that there's probably plenty of minstrel and folk songs stretching back hundreds and thousands of years of musicians making political statements. And we can go back to even to classical music, where Beethoven's Third was originally called Bonaparte in tribute to Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804, which Beethoven withdrew later. And then we have composers like Shostakovich, who wrote against the Soviet regime, and Prokofiev, who wrote for the Soviet regime, and vice versa. And then we have Wagner, who interestingly has been associated with Nazism, and although per se was not a Nazi, just this correlation that the Nazis adopted Wagner's music and had appreciation for it makes this political association. It's kind of odd in some ways. But we have all sorts of music, of course, that have political histories, and most forms have some political history going back a certain way. Most people are familiar with the protest songs, folk songs, and rock songs of the 60s, and that's their first awareness of politics in music. We have the many bands that had numerous songs that had a high level of political awareness, and of course with rock generally adopted a more liberal ideology. Everybody from the Fugs to Jefferson Airplane to Bob Dylan, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young with Ohio, and Creedence Clearwater Revival with songs like Fortunate Son, and then Buffalo Springfield, For What It's Worth, and the like. And of course John Lennon of the Beatles was very politically active, and a lot of people have problems with somebody in such a high-profile, good-timey band getting political in his later years. And he alienated a large portion of his audience with what would be considered extremely liberal policies. Generally, his policy was just anti-war, so there wasn't a lot more to it than that. And then bands like Steppenwolf, who also had a lot of political oriented songs, were actually very savvy for the time. And this tradition of rock, of course, continued with the political stylings of punk rock and groups like The Clash, and it goes on to people like Rage Against the Machine. And rap also has quite a history of politics, at least certain groups like Public Enemy, and there's an inherent political ideology in a lot of that music. But so anyway, music has been a vehicle for politics for some time, and like I say, it has quite a history. So what's curious for me, though, is country music is propaganda. And how did music that's basically about the values of the rural working class, how that became the musical vehicle for the ideology for a Republican Party, who is generally warmongers and corporatists. And so it seems to be an odd juxtaposition of the GOP party values and the party values of their base. and the fact that there's such a disconnect. The GOP party exploits this mythology to use the rural working class, and so that's an unfortunate aspect of this. But let's get back to the story because this is already running kind of long. So as far as country music go, we're going to go back to the 20s in the U.S., and that's kind of when this phenomenon started, of the evolution of country music and where we are today. And in the 20s in the U.S., we actually had the likes of Henry Ford and the KKK, and they were using country music and hillbilly bands and western swing bands and paying and supporting political messages from these groups to counter what they considered the corrupt influence of black and Jewish jazz music. So we had that force in play in the 20s, and certainly this would be considered a somewhat conservative ideology. But generally speaking, once you move into the 20s and 30s, most of these people like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Hank Williams and the like were writing songs that were politically active, generally tended to be more liberal values and as a left-wing vehicle. So that's something that people forget, that the phenomenon of country music as a conservative vehicle for ideology is a new development. Country music and folk was always associated with populist, left-wing, liberal, and even socialists and communists. And then the turning point came in the late 60s and the early 70s, and this is going to be an interesting fact for some people out there. It was Merle Haggard who actually kind of started this association of conservatism, country music, with his big hit in 1969, Okie from Muskogee. And even though it was a parody, he basically tapped into something in the country as far as mocking hippies and mocking the counterculture movement and all the things that the so-called silent majority, people with traditional values in America, were interested in. They were trying to make a statement and embracing this statement that reflected what they considered their values, even though youth values were dominating. And there's no coincidence that country music should come to adopt this conservative ideology right at the very time when rock music was in its most dynamic period and was championing ideas that were important to youth and liberal values, what were considered liberal values, and the anti-war movement and that sort of thing. So I find that a very crucial element in this development of country music as U.S. propaganda and a vehicle for conservative ideology. It was countering the popular rock music of the day, and this still continues to this day, although we have a lot of rock bands that like to invoke mythology and dragons and Satan and that sort of thing now, so a lot of bands aren't quite as political, but we still have that element out there. So this is where it really gets interesting, because Richard Nixon actually is the one who cashed in on this new phenomenon, country music as a conservative, silent majority representation. And Nixon and all these country music organizations and country stars had a reciprocal relationship which developed, and this actually skyrocketed the popularity of country music, particularly out of the South and the Midwest. And by 1970, 2/3 of all country music records were sold outside of the South. And Nixon made October 1970 Country Music Month, and in 1974 he was the first ever president to visit the Grand Ole Opry. And in 1970, Tex Ritter even did an album called "Thank You, Mr. President." And so this is definitely where this companionship of Republican ideology and country music was solidified. Although it's kind of interesting, because in that same period, country music got popularized. You haven't even had major television shows with Mac Davis and Johnny Cash and a lot of other country stars. And who could ever forget Hee Haw? But also, let's not forget that in 1974, Olivia Newton-John, of all people, was the top country female vocal. So the pop nature of country music was already in full swing by this time. And that's another aspect of the development of country music as a ideology vehicle is the fact that it became more and more pop. And interestingly enough, as we've seen, it's adapted a lot of the trappings of what used to be considered rock music, with Keith Richards like guitar players on stage with these country stars, and they're breaking their guitars and having screaming guitar solos and loud power chords and all kinds of stuff like that. So that's a rather interesting, but I think that generally has to do with boomers who used to listen to rock have mellowed out just enough that country music sounds just about perfect to them right now. And so we have the state of country now as pop. It's rockified, as it were, but then, of course, we have the reaction, which is the alternative country scene that is thriving right now. And a lot of the alternative country actually is once again embracing a lot of liberal values. So things could change in country music. And that's good in some ways because, like I say, I have no problems really with Republican ideology and conservative ideology per se in country music. Actually, that's a good element to it. But unfortunately, in its worst forms, country music as conservative ideology is simplistic, superficial, and follows the government narrative. It totally accepts the government narrative. It's completely behind warmongering, and there's even country songs that elicit a lot of Islamophobia and that sort of thing. So that's the part of country music that I'm talking about as U.S. propaganda, because unfortunately, a lot of country music is used to keep the Republican base in a stasis, and where nostalgia, unfortunately, is harvested as a political tool to keep people in this rut and sustain this mythology and sustain this government narrative and sustain a vision of the world that's not necessarily accurate. I think one writer who has a great love of country music, and although this paragraph I'm going to read is actually rather condescending, the rest of the essay is very informative and very affectionate towards country music. So I don't want to make this sound like I'm putting it down. These are actually all good things that Mr. Will Wilkinson wrote in this essay, and I think it encapsulates the basic idea of where country music is at. So he goes to say, quote, "In the car, I listen to country music. Country has an ideology. Not to say country has a position on abortion exactly, but country music taken as a whole has a position on life. Small towns, dirt roads, love at first sight, hot-blooded kids having a good old time, getting hitched, America, showing up for church, venturing confused into the big, wide world only to come back to Alabama forever, since there ain't a damn thing out there in the Orient or France what compares to that spot by the river under the trembling willows where first you kiss the girl you've known in your heart since second grade is the only girl you would ever truly love. Fishing, how Grandpa, who fought in 2 wars, worked 3 jobs, raised 4 kids, and never once complained, can't hardly wait to join Grandma in heaven, because life just ain't no good without her delicious pies," unquote. And that's as good a summary as I've ever heard of country music. And that shows that it just has an intrinsic idea about living a decent life that is very admirable. And for that, I'm grateful to country music. But like I say, the other side of country music is the fact that, once again, we have useful idiots being used to perpetrate an ideology that politicians, elites, and the handlers and bootlickers all use to manipulate everyone else. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too. Oh, and make sure to read some of the attachments if you find this topic interesting at all. There's some really good articles. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too. That's what I said.